Section 25 of the Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Hannah Lynn. The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals by Charles Darwin. Chapter 13. Self-Attention, Shame, Shyness, Modesty, Blushing, continued, Part 3. Modesty. This is another powerful agent in exciting blushes. But the word modesty includes very different states of the mind. It implies humility, and we often judge of this by persons being greatly pleased and blushing at slight praise, or by being annoyed at praise which seems to them too high according to their own humble standard of themselves. Blushing here has the usual signification of regard for the opinion of others, but modesty frequently relates to acts of indelicacy, and indelicacy is an affair of etiquette, as we clearly see with the nations that go altogether or nearly naked. He who is modest and blushes easily at acts of this nature does so because they are breaches of a firmly and wisely established etiquette. This is indeed shown by the derivation of the word modest from modus, a measure or standard of behaviour. A blush due to this form of modesty is, moreover, apt to be intense, because it generally relates to the opposite sex. And we have seen how in all cases our liability to blush is thus increased. We apply the term modest, as it would appear, to those who have an humble opinion of themselves, and to those who are extremely sensitive about an indelicate word or deed, simply because in both cases blushes are readily excited, for those two frames of mind have nothing else in common. Shyness also, from this same cause, is often mistaken for modesty in the sense of humility. Some persons flush up, as I have observed and have been assured, at any sudden and disagreeable recollection. The commonest cause seemed to be the sudden remembrance of not having done something for another person which had been promised. In this case it may be that the thought passes half unconsciously through the mind, "What will he think of me?" and then the flush would partake of the nature of a true blush. But whether such flushes are in most cases due to the capillary circulation being affected is very doubtful, for we must remember that almost every strong emotion, such as anger or great joy, acts on the heart and causes the face to redden. The fact that blushes may be excited in absolute solitude seems opposed to the view here taken, namely that the habit originally arose from thinking about what others think of us. Several ladies, who are great blushers, are unanimous in regard to solitude, and some of them believe that they have blushed in the dark. From what Mr. Forbes had stated with respect to the eye mirage, and from my own sensations, I have no doubt that this latter statement is correct. Shakespeare, therefore, erred when he made Juliet, who was not even by herself, say to Romeo, Act 2, Scene 2, "Thou know'st the mask of night is on my face, else would a maiden blush bepained my cheek, for that which thou hast heard me speak to-night." But when a blush is excited in solitude, the cause almost always relates to the thoughts of others about us, to acts done in their presence, or suspected by them, or again when we reflect what others would have thought of us had they known of the act. Nevertheless, one or two of my informants believe that they have blushed from shame at acts in no way relating to others. If this be so, we must attribute the result to the force of inveterate habit and association, under a state of mind closely analogous to that which ordinarily excites a blush. Nor need we feel surprise at this, as even sympathy with another person who commits a flagrant breach of etiquette is believed, as we have just seen, sometimes to cause a blush. Finally, then, I conclude that blushing, whether due to shyness, to shame for a real crime, to shame from a breach of the laws of etiquette, to modesty from humility, to modesty from an indelicacy, depends in all cases on the same principle. This principle being a sensitive regard for the opinion, more particularly for the depreciation of others, primarily in relation to our personal appearance, especially of our faces, and secondarily, through the force of association and habit, in relation to the opinion of others on our conduct. Theory of blushing. We have now to consider, why should the thought that others are thinking about us affect our capillary circulation? Sir C. Bell insists that blushing is a provision for expression, as may be inferred from the color extending only to the surface of the face, neck, and breast, the parts most exposed. It is not acquired, it is from the beginning. Dr. Burgess believes that it was designed by the Creator in order that the soul might have sovereign power of displaying in the cheeks the various internal emotions of the moral feelings, so as to serve as a check on ourselves and as a sign to others that we were violating rules which ought to be held sacred. Gratiolet merely remarks, well, comme il est dans l'ordre de la nature que l'être social le plus intelligent soit aussi le plus intelligible, cette faculté de rougeur et de pâleur qui distingue l'homme est un signe naturel de sa haute perfection. The belief that blushing was specially designed by the Creator is opposed to the general theory of evolution, which is now so largely accepted. But it forms no part of my duty here to argue on the general question. Those who believe in design will find it difficult to account for shyness being the most frequent and efficient of all the causes of blushing, as it makes the blusher to suffer and the beholder uncomfortable, without being of the least service to either of them. They will also find it difficult to account for Negroes and other dark-colored races blushing, in whom a change of color in the skin is scarcely or not at all visible. No doubt a slight blush adds to the beauty of a maiden's face, and the Circassian women who are capable of blushing invariably fetch a higher price in the seraglio of the Sultan than less acceptable women. But the firmest believer in the efficacy of sexual selection will hardly suppose that blushing was acquired as a sexual ornament. This view would also be opposed to what has just been said about the dark-colored races blushing in an invisible manner. The hypothesis which appears to me the most probable, though it may at first seem rash, is that attention closely directed to any part of the body tends to interfere with the ordinary and tonic contraction of the small arteries of that part. These vessels, in consequence, become at such times more or less relaxed, and are instantly filled with arterial blood. This tendency will have been much strengthened if frequent attention has been paid during many generations to the same part, owing to nerve force readily flowing along accustomed channels, and by the power of inheritance. Whenever we believe that others are depreciating or even considering our personal appearance, our attention is vividly directed to the outer and visible parts of our bodies. And of all such parts we are most sensitive about our faces, as no doubt has been the case during many past generations. Therefore, assuming for the moment that the capillary vessels can be acted on by close attention, those of the face will have become eminently susceptible. Through the force of association, the same effects will tend to follow whenever we think that others are considering or censuring our actions or character. As the basis of this theory rests on mental attention having some power to influence the capillary circulation, it will be necessary to give a considerable body of details, bearing more or less directly on this subject. Several observers, who from their wide experience and knowledge are eminently capable of forming a sound judgment, are convinced that attention or consciousness which latter term Sir H. Holland thinks the more explicit, concentrated on almost any part of the body, produces some direct physical effect on it. This applies to the movement of the involuntary muscles and of the voluntary muscles when acting involuntarily, to the secretion of the glands, to the activity of the senses and sensations, and even to the nutrition of parts. It is known that the involuntary movements of the heart are affected if close attention be paid to them. Gratiolet gives the case of a man who, by continually watching and counting his own pulse, at last caused 1 beat out of every 6 to intermit. On the other hand, my father told me of a careful observer who certainly had heart disease and died from it, and who positively stated that his pulse was habitually irregular to an extreme degree, yet to his great disappointment it invariably became regular as soon as my father entered the room. Sir H. Holland remarks that the effect upon the circulation of a part from the consciousness suddenly directed and fixed upon it is often obvious and immediate. Professor Laycock, who has particularly attended to phenomena of this nature, insists that when the attention is directed to any portion of the body, innervation and circulation are excited locally, and the functional activity of that portion developed. It is generally believed that the peristaltic movements of the intestines are influenced by attention being paid to them at fixed recurrent periods, and these movements depend on the contraction of unstripped and involuntary muscles. The abnormal action of the voluntary muscles in epilepsy, chorea, and hysteria is known to be influenced by the expectation of an attack, and by the sight of other patients similarly affected. So it is with the involuntary acts of yawning and laughing. Certain glands are much influenced by thinking of them, or of the conditions under which they have been habitually excited. This is familiar to every one in the increased flow of saliva, when the thought, for instance, of intensely acid fruit is kept before the mind. It was shown in our 6th chapter that an earnest and long-continued desire either to repress or to increase the action of the lacrymal glands is effectual. Some curious cases have been recorded in the case of women of the power of the mind on the mammary glands, and still more remarkable ones in relation to the uterine functions. See Gratiolet on this subject, de la Fise, page 287. Dr. J. Crichton-Browne, from his observations on the insane, is convinced that attention directed for a prolonged period on any part or organ may ultimately influence its capillary circulation and nutrition. He has given me some extraordinary cases. One of these, which cannot here be related in full, refers to a married woman 50 years of age, who labored under the firm and long-continued delusion that she was pregnant. When the expected period arrived, she acted precisely as if she had been really delivered of a child, and seemed to suffer extreme pain, so that the perspiration broke out on her forehead. The result was that a state of things returned, continuing for 3 days, which had ceased during the 6 previous years. Mr. Braid gives, in his Magic, Hypnotism, and etc., 1852, page 95, and in his other works, analogous cases, as well as other facts showing the great influence of the will on the mammary glands, even on one breast alone. When we direct our whole attention to any one sense, its acuteness is increased, and the continued habit of close attention, as with blind people to that of hearing, and with the blind and deaf to that of touch, appears to improve the sense in question permanently. There is also some reason to believe, judging from the capacities of different races of man, that the effects are inherited. Turning to ordinary sensations, it is well known that pain is increased by attending to it. And Sir B. Brodie goes so far as to believe that pain may be felt in any part of the body to which attention is closely drawn. Sir H. Holland also remarks that we become not only conscious of the existence of a part subjected to concentrated attention, but we experience in it various odd sensations as of weight, heat, cold, tingling, or itching. Lastly, some physiologists maintain that the mind can influence the nutrition of parts. Sir J. Paget has given a curious instance of the power, not indeed of the mind, but of the nervous system, on the hair. A lady who is subject to attacks of what is called nervous headache always finds in the morning after such a one that some patches of her hair are white, as if powdered with starch. The change is effected in a night, and in a few days after, the hairs gradually regain their dark brownish color. We thus see that close attention certainly affects various parts and organs, which are not properly under the control of the will. By what means attention, perhaps the most wonderful of all the wondrous powers of the mind, is effected, is an extremely obscure subject. According to Müller, the process by which the sensory cells of the brain are rendered, through the will, susceptible of receiving more intense and distinct impressions, is closely analogous to that by which the motor cells are excited to send nerve force to the voluntary muscles. There are many points of analogy in the action of the sensory and motor nerve cells. For instance, the familiar fact that close attention to any one sense causes fatigue, like the prolonged exertion of any one muscle. When therefore we voluntarily concentrate our attention on any part of the body, the cells of the brain which receive impressions or sensations from that part are, it is probable, in some unknown manner stimulated into activity. This may account, without any local change in the part to which our attention is earnestly directed, for pain or odd sensations being there felt or increased. If, however, the part is furnished with muscles, we cannot feel sure, as Mr. Michael Foster has remarked to me, that some slight impulse may not be unconsciously sent to such muscles, and this would probably cause an obscure sensation in the part. In a large number of cases, as with the salivary and lacrymal glands, intestinal canal, and etc., the power of attention seems to rest either chiefly, or as some physiologists think, exclusively, on the vasomotor system being affected in such a manner that more blood is allowed to flow into the capillaries of the part in question. This increased action of the capillaries may in some cases be combined with the simultaneously increased activity of the sensorium. The manner in which the mind affects the vasomotor system may be conceived in the following manner. When we actually taste sour fruit, an impression is sent through the gustatory nerves to a certain part of the sensorium. This transmits nerve force to the vasomotor center, which consequently allows the muscular coats of the small arteries that permeate the salivary glands to relax. Hence, more blood flows into these glands, and they secrete a copious supply of saliva. Now it does not seem an improbable assumption that, when we reflect intently on a sensation, the same part of the sensorium, or a closely connected part of it, is brought into a state of activity, in the same manner as when we actually perceive the sensation. If so, the same cells in the brain will be excited, though perhaps in a less degree by vividly thinking about a sour taste, as by perceiving it, and they will transmit in the one case, as in the other, nerve force to the vasomotor center with the same results. To give another, and in some respects more appropriate illustration, if a man stands before a hot fire, his face reddens. This appears to be due, as Mr. Michael Foster informs me, in part to the local action of the heat, and in part to a reflex action from the vasomotor centers. In this latter case, the heat affects the nerves of the face. These transmit an impression to the sensory cells of the brain, which act on the vasomotor center, and this reacts on the small arteries of the face, relaxing them and allowing them to become filled with blood. Here again, it seems not improbable that if we were repeatedly to concentrate with great earnestness our attention on the recollection of our heated faces, the same part of the sensorium which give us the consciousness of actual heat would be in some slight degree stimulated, and would in consequence tend to transmit some nerve force to the vasomotor centers, so as to relax the capillaries of the face. Now, as men during endless generations have had their attention often and earnestly directed to their personal appearance, and especially to their faces, any incipient tendency in the facial capillaries to be thus affected will have become in the course of time greatly strengthened through the principles just referred to, namely, nerve force passing readily along accustomed channels and inherited habit. Thus, as it appears to me, a plausible explanation is afforded of the leading phenomena connected with the act of blushing. Recapitulation. Men and women, and especially the young, have always valued in a high degree their personal appearance, and have likewise regarded the appearance of others. The face has been the chief object of attention, though when man aboriginally went naked, the whole surface of his body would have been attended to. Our self-attention is excited almost exclusively by the opinion of others, for no person living in absolute solitude would care about his appearance. Everyone feels blame more acutely than praise. Now, whenever we know or suppose that others are depreciating our personal appearance, our attention is strongly drawn towards ourselves, more especially to our faces. The probable effect of this will be, as has just been explained, to excite into activity that part of the sensorium which receives the sensory nerves of the face, and this will react through the vasomotor system on the facial capillaries. By frequent reiteration during numberless generations, the process will have become so habitual in association with the belief that others are thinking of us, that even a suspicion of their depreciation suffices to relax the capillaries, without any conscious thought about our faces. With some sensitive persons, it is enough even to notice their dress to produce the same effect. Through the force also of association and inheritance, our capillaries are relaxed whenever we know or imagine that any one is blaming, though in silence, our actions, thoughts, or character, and again when we are highly praised. On this hypothesis, we can understand how it is that the face blushes much more than any other part of the body, though the whole surface is somewhat affected, more especially with the races which still go nearly naked. It is not at all surprising that the dark-colored races should blush, though no change of color is visible in their skins. From the principle of inheritance, it is not surprising that persons born blind should blush. We can understand why the young are much more affected than the old, and women more than men, and why the opposite sexes especially excite each other's blushes. It becomes obvious why personal remarks should be particularly liable to cause blushing, and why the most powerful of all the causes is shyness. For shyness relates to the presence and opinion of others, and the shy are always more or less self-conscious. With respect to real shame from moral delinquencies, we can perceive why it is not guilt, but the thought that others think us guilty, which raises a blush. A man reflecting on a crime committed in solitude and stung by his conscience does not blush, yet he will blush under the vivid recollection of a detected fault, or of one committed in the presence of others, the degree of blushing being closely related to the feeling of regard for those who have detected, witnessed, or suspected his fault. Breaches of conventional rules of conduct, if they are rigidly insisted on by our equals or superiors, often cause more intense blushes even than a detected crime. And an act which is really criminal, if not blamed by our equals, hardly raises a tinge of color on our cheeks. Modesty from humility, or from an indelicacy, excites a vivid blush, as both relate to the judgment or fixed customs of others. From the intimate sympathy which exists between the capillary circulation of the surface of the head and of the brain, whenever there is intense blushing, there will be some, and often great, confusion of mind. This is frequently accompanied by awkward movements, and sometimes by the involuntary twitching of certain muscles. As blushing, according to this hypothesis, is an indirect result of attention, originally directed to our personal appearance, that is to the surface of the body, and more especially to the face, we can understand the meaning of the gestures which accompany blushing throughout the world. These consist in hiding the face, or turning it toward the ground, or to one side. The eyes are generally averted, or are restless, for to look at the man who causes us to feel shame or shyness immediately brings home in intolerable manner the consciousness that his gaze is directed on us. Through the principle of associated habit, the same movements of the face and eyes are practiced, and can, indeed, hardly be avoided, whenever we know or believe that others are blaming, or too strongly praising, our moral conduct. End of section 25.